Hello YouTube, and welcome to my channel. In part 1 of this series, I made my argument against abortion. In this video, I will address an argument for abortion and show why it fails to justify abortion. The argument I will address is the so-called argument from rationality. While I touched on it in the first part, I want to make a more serious critique here. I'll first present the argument, take a detour into some theory of mind philosophy, tell a story about Soviet-era genetic experiments, and then jump into Plato's cave to explore some metaphysics. Hopefully, when we emerge on the other side, we'll have deconstructed the argument from rationality and show why it's flawed. The argument from rationality is essentially as follows. Premise 1. Human beings are distinguished from other species by their rationality. Premise 2. It is wrong to kill human beings, but it is okay to kill other animals. Conclusion 1. Therefore, the presence of rationality is what makes it wrong to kill human beings. Premise 3. The presence of rationality is what makes it wrong to kill human beings. Premise 4. Human fetuses are not rational. Conclusion 2. Therefore, it is not wrong to kill a human fetus. Premise 5. It is not wrong to kill a human fetus. Premise 6. Abortion is the deliberate killing of a human fetus. Final conclusion, therefore, abortion is not wrong. Now, the argument made certainly appears valid, and the premises are mostly sound. Premise 1 has been historically accepted as the true definition of human beings, rational animals. Some might point out that premise 2 needs a little bit more nuance. It may be acceptable to kill human beings in self-defense, war, or capital punishment, and there may be some circumstances in which it's not alright to kill animals. But these points don't really affect the argument. Premise 3 generally follows from those two, though I hope I'll show why it may be dangerous to phrase it that way. Premise 4 certainly appears to be true. Premise 5 seems to follow from 3 and 4, and premise 6 is definitional. So what could be wrong with this argument? If you haven't spotted it already, it may surprise you that premise 4 is actually the problem. Now, one could object to it on the grounds that we don't actually know if fetuses are rational or not. It's true that young ones don't have the physical structures that we believe are necessary for consciousness, and therefore couldn't possibly possess it. But this is actually a categorical error, and we're going to use a little bit of theory of mind to explain why. Rationality, like pain, is a self-experienced trait. It can't really be measured or defined by an external observer. Think about it this way. Could you believe that you are in pain but be wrong about it? You could go to a doctor to try to diagnose your pain, and the doctor might say there's nothing physically wrong with you, but that doesn't change the fact that you are in pain. Or on the contrary, imagine the doctor saying, your vitals tell me that you should be in excruciating pain right now, but instead, you don't feel anything. Can you really be said to be in pain? The word pain, therefore, refers to the sensation of pain, and not to any change in the physical structures associated with the sensation. The same could be said about rationality. Just because something doesn't physically appear to be rational does not mean that it can't be. There is an important distinction between a mind and a brain, and just because every mind we think we have scientific evidence of has been associated with a brain doesn't mean that there are no minds that don't have brains. Therefore, just because a fetus doesn't have a brain doesn't mean that it can't be conscious. Dr. Verschuuren, a fantastic scientist who has his own YouTube channel, has done a great introductory video on this topic. I'll leave a link in the description to it. Philosophy of mind is a really fun topic, and you've got a lot of great minds weighing in on it, like David Chalmers, Daniel Dennett, Robert Kirk, and Thomas Nagel. I'm going to do a standalone video on it because I want to talk about philosophy zombies, which I promise you is a real thing. For now, though, I think you get the idea. Just because a fetus doesn't have the physical apparatus for consciousness that adult human beings have, does not mean they are necessarily not rational. This, as strong an objection as it is actually not the strongest argument for why premise 4 is wrong. After all, a response could be made that while fetuses might be conscious, they don't have the same kind of consciousness that we do, and that's really what we're talking about. Which is fair. Neither is the argument I referenced in part 1 of this series, that at least some fetuses are just as rational as babies. So if we can kill fetuses, then we must also be allowed to kill babies. While this argument is true, it would only argue that abortion is wrong after the point that fetuses resemble babies in rationality. Someone arguing for abortion could make a significant distinction between very young fetuses and babies on this point. So what is the strongest argument against premise 4? The strongest argument is that it makes a category error between species and individuals. In other words, it takes the characteristic of rationality, which in premises 1 through 3 we were applying to the human species, and then applies it to the individual, but still treating it like it's referring to the same thing. Now, this argument is subtle and it requires a bit of abstract thought, so I want to give an analogy that, while being imperfect, somewhat elucidates the problem here. So let's take a quick trip to Soviet Russia. Здравствуйте, товарищи! Меня зовут Benedict 17th. Hello, comrades. My name is Benedict 17. Welcome to Soviet Russia. The year is 1948 and the Lenin Academy of Agricultural Sciences has just announced that Lysenkoism will be taught as the only correct agricultural theory. Lysenkoism is named after Trofim Lysenko, a previously unknown biologist who's promised to end Russia's agricultural crisis caused by farm collectivization and the killing of the kulaks. He has been promoted by the Soviet Party because he's claimed his research could triple or even quadruple Russian farm yields. As you can see, he is a very happy man. Alright, I'm done with the bad accent. But Lysenko's plan for Russia's agricultural program was simple. The theories of genetics and evolution demonstrated that desirable traits could be passed from parent to offspring. Therefore, he reasoned, if you were to induce a change in the parent, that change would be passed down to the offspring. That is, acquired traits in life could be passed down to offspring. So, a population of mice that have had their tails cut off would after a few generations produce mice without tails. And plants that have been treated to withstand Russia's harsh winters and produce bigger and more frequent yields would pass those traits on as well. Thus, it should only take a few seasons of selective breeding for Russia's crops to have developed these traits across the country. This theory is intuitive, attractive, efficient, and of course dead wrong. What gets passed down to successive generations is not any changes to a creature's phenotype that it acquired throughout its lifetime, but the genetic code that the animal had since it was conceived. Of course, now we do have the technology that allows us to mess around with genetic codes directly, but that's a whole different story. In general, causing some kind of environmental or physical change to an individual of a species won't cause changes that will be passed down to the rest of the species. This confusion between an individual and a species of Lysenko ended up costing the Soviet Union a lot. Because Lysenkoism was promoted as the only true agricultural theory, and over 3,000 scientists who dissented were forced to go into hiding, were sent to gulags, or killed, Russian agriculture and biology were set back decades, and the Soviet Union's food crisis got even worse. So why did these individuals reject Lysenkoism? Because they understood what Lysenko did not. The accidental traits of individuals within a species don't define the species. Now, what was true about the differences between species and individuals in biology can also be said about the difference between species and individuals in metaphysics. We can refer to dogs in general as barking mammals, but this doesn't mean that if a given dog doesn't bark, perhaps it lost its voice, that means it isn't a dog. Furthermore, if you teach a dog to meow, does it make it a cat? Obviously not. This thought, as banal as it seems, makes an important point about how we think about what things are, and therefore how we ought to treat things. The reason we know that teaching a dog to meow doesn't make it a cat is that we recognize that being a cat requires more than simply having all the attributes, characteristics, or abilities of a cat. A cat is not a cat because it can meow. Rather, cats can meow because they are cats. Now, we may define and recognize a cat as a meowing mammal, and if I were trying to decide whether something I saw is in fact a dog-like looking cat or a cat-like looking dog, I might use meowing or not meowing as the distinguishing feature, but that would just be my way of distinguishing between cats and dogs. It would not suggest that meowing causes something to be a cat. Thus, a dog that has learned to meow is still not a cat, and a cat that has ceased to meow has not ceased being a cat. This is important when we consider human beings. A human being is not a human being because he is rational. Rather, rationality is a power human beings have at a certain level of development. So just because human beings are rational animals, that does not mean that all human beings are rational all the time. Nor does it mean that if a human is not rational, it is not a human being. Rational animal distinguishes the human species from other species. It is not meant to determine whether individuals are part of that species. Therefore, when it comes to questions of universal human rights, the presence of rationality, however we define it, cannot be a reason for denying an individual those rights. A person cannot be denied human rights on the grounds that he cannot exercise them rationally, because the expression of rationality is not what makes a human human. This is what's wrong with the argument from rationality. In premise 1 through 3, we are using rationality to distinguish between the human species and other species. In premise 4, there is a hidden shift to using rationality to speak about individuals. Now, a supporter of abortion could come back and say, it doesn't matter that a fetus is human. We only care about protecting human beings that express rationality. But this becomes a different argument. At this point, they are not saying that fetuses are inhuman because of irrationality and therefore not covered by human rights. They are arguing that fetuses are a kind of human that's okay to kill. At this point, the only response one can make is that all people, regardless of their qualities or stage of development, are deserving of individual rights. Thank you for watching. This series will continue with showing the flaws of other pro-abortion arguments. If you liked this video and would like to see more like it, please like and subscribe. If you'd like to support me, you can donate to me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Until next time, I'm Benedict the 17th. Go with God.